We're in Mark chapter 8. I know you may have thought I was going to do a Father's Day message, but nope. I'm jumping right through Mark because we're halfway through the book. Do you feel like you've made some kind of accomplishment? Right? Mark has 16 chapters. We are halfway through Mark chapter 8, and you're going to see a division between the book. The first part of the book has primarily been showing us the person of Jesus. Who is he? He does these amazing things. He heals the leper. He heals the paralytic. He calms the wind and the waves from the sea. He walks on water. He feeds the multitude. And then he does it again. And all this is to come to a spot in Mark chapter 8. Actually, we can look at it in verse 21, where Jesus asked the question, "Do you still not understand?" At this point, we should be able to understand a little bit of who Jesus is. Even if it's dimly or blurry, you should be able to get a sense of who Jesus is. Jesus is the Messiah. That's something Mark told us at the opening of his book. Remember? He opened his book by saying, this is the gospel of the Messiah, Jesus, right? He starts out that way. In Mark chapter 8, something changes. The disciples finally are able to see Jesus clearly for who he is, but they are unsure of what that means and what his mission is going to be. And for the rest of the book of Mark, Jesus is going to be showing us how the Messiah has to suffer, right? I think that's going to be important as we go forward, because sometimes you can see the person of Jesus clearly, but you can miss what he's come to do, and you can miss what it is to follow him, right? That's going to be a main theme in tonight's sermon. You can see the person of Jesus clearly, but you can miss what he's come to do and what it means to follow him. It's almost like the miracle we're about to read, because in this story, Jesus spits on another person and heals him. He's blind. He's able to see. Let's read that miracle. It's Mark chapter 8, verse 22. Here's what it says. They came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him outside the village. When he had spit on the man's eyes, right? And when he spit on the man's eyes, he put his hand on him. And Jesus said, "Do you see anything?" He looked up and said, "I see people. They look like trees walking around." Once more, Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes. Then his eyes were open. His sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Jesus sent him home, saying, "Don't even go into the village." Right? We have this miracle, this miraculous healing of a man who is blind. And again, this is a way that Mark does this, and it almost seems like Jesus' miracle didn't work. Like maybe his power was incomplete. Did you notice that? Like Jesus spits in the man's eyes and puts his hands over them, but the man is able to see, but it's blurry. And you have to ask, at least as I went through it, I began to question, well, what is it with Jesus at this point? We know that he's powerful enough to heal this man. We've seen it already as we've gone through the gospel. In fact, we saw Jesus raise up a dead girl, the synagogue leader, who was 12 years old, and she had passed away, and Jesus said, "Don't be afraid," right? And he brings her back to life. We've seen Jesus feed the multitude. In the previous chapter, we saw Jesus heal a demon-possessed girl when he wasn't even in the room. And now it seems like something's the matter with Jesus' power. He heals the person, but it's blurry. Not quite. It doesn't quite take the first time. And so the second time, he has to put his hands over his eyes, and now he can see clearly. See, I believe that story, that miracle actually happened, but I think it's a little bit parabolic or a parable of what it's like to be for the disciples so far. As we've come to Mark chapter 8, they've begun to see who Jesus really is, but they don't quite see him clearly, right? Maybe for them, it's people, but it looks like trees just waving around. It's blurry. And maybe that's where you are as we've come to this point in the book. You've kind of started to understand who Jesus is. You see his power. You see what he's claimed about himself. But do you really see him clearly? Is it just a little bit blurry? I think that's what happens as we go forward in the Gospel of Mark. The disciples finally, after asking, who is this that can control the wind and the waves? They finally come to a place where they can say for sure who Jesus is. But they still are blurry, not quite able to understand his mission and what it means to follow him. And that's what we're going to get into today, right? My first point is the disciples begin to see Jesus clearly. That's my first point. The disciples, like the man, begin to see Jesus. And they can kind of see him clearly, but maybe it's going to be a little blurry as well. See, in verse 27, right after this miracle, Jesus and his disciples went to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. That's the place where Herod lived, right? Named after Caesar, but also Herod's son, Philip. And that's where Herod's palace was. And he doesn't go into Caesarea Philippi. He goes to the villages around them. And do you notice what Mark says? On the way, he asked them. I love that because, do you know in the early church, the church was called the Way? You're supposed to follow Jesus on the way. And that's what's happening. The disciples are following Jesus on the way. And Jesus asks them the first question. Who do people say I am? See, as we've gone through the gospel, you should have some answers for that question, right? Who do people say that Jesus is? It's like a man on the street. Who's ever done or seen a man on the street interview? You just ask random people as they're coming out of the grocery store, like, hey, what do you think about this subject? What do you think about this subject? Or maybe you want to think of it like the polls are in. Jesus is asking the disciples, take a poll. What do the people around me think? Who do they think I am? And the disciples give all the positive answers. They say things like this. They replied, some say John the Baptist, others Elijah, and still others one of the prophets. They all relate Jesus to a messenger, a prophet. Is Jesus a prophet? Yes, absolutely, right? In fact, we're in Nazareth. And do you remember what Jesus said in Nazareth? A prophet is without honor except for his own town, right? So Jesus will take that title, prophet. That's definitely who he is, but he's so much more than a prophet, right? In fact, if you just keep him there, then you've devalued who he truly is. He's more than a prophet. He's greater than Moses. He's greater than Elijah. He's greater than John the Baptist. But these are all the positive answers. Imagine living in the first century, seeing somebody doing all these things. You'd begin to wonder, well, who is this? Maybe it's John the Baptist who's come to life. They all like John. Maybe it's Elijah. See, Malachi said that Elijah would return, and Elijah would bring in or usher in the Messiah. Of course, we know that John the Baptist, if you choose to accept it, right? That's what Jesus says is the Messiah or the Elijah that you've been waiting for. And so, not Elijah. Maybe one of the other prophets. The people of Israel were looking for a future prophet to come. See, in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses says that this prophet's going to come. Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 15, it says this. It says, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your fellow Israelites. You must listen to him, for this is what he's asked, right? Like the point is that God is going to raise up this prophet like Moses. You know what Moses did? He led the people out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery, out of their oppression. The people of Israel were ready for someone like that to come again. A prophet like Moses who's going to rescue them from the oppression of Rome, of the tax collectors. By the way, I think somebody came in today, I think it was you, Don, said, I wouldn't put the tax collector booth in front of the door. People will show up and just want to leave, right? We put the tax collector booth right by the door. But the people of Israel were looking for that prophet, one like Moses who's going to rescue them from the oppression that they're dealing with under these beastly kingdoms like Rome. And maybe they're starting to see that Jesus is someone like that. Maybe he's John the Baptist. Maybe he's Elijah. Maybe he's just one of the prophets. Maybe he's come to help us. But those are all the positive responses. Do you remember some negative ones as we've come this far in Mark? The religious leader says it's by the power of Beelzebul that this man casts out demons, right? It's by Satan and Jesus says, can Satan stand against himself? Of course not. That kingdom will fall. That's what Jesus says. See, when you start to get a man on the street, take a poll, who is Jesus? You might get answers like that. He's a good guy. He's a prophet. He's one sent by God. You might get all those kind of answers. In fact, if we were to ask people in our own society those things, you'd get answers similar, right? Good teacher, right? That you might say that. He showed us the way of life, somebody might say that. But C.S. Lewis said that Jesus can be one of three things: a lunatic, a liar, or the Lord, right? Of course, then More Than a Carpenter came out, and then the updated edition came out and said there's a fourth thing that he could be. He could be a legend, right? And then it disproves all of those. See, Jesus really was who he said he was, did what he said he did. He's not a legend. And if Jesus couldn't back up what he said with his miracles, then he would be a liar, but he was able to do that. He wasn't crazy. Now, see, it leaves one thing. Jesus is truly Lord. But when you ask people on the street, people in our culture, you'll get all kinds of answers, but they're not, they might even be right, but they devalue who Jesus is. Like these people say, he's a prophet, and that's true about Jesus, but he's so much more. And so Jesus asked them a second question. He asked those disciples a second question. What about you? He'll say. Let's read it. In Mark chapter 8, Jesus says to the disciples, this is verse 29, but what about you? He asked, who do you say I am? And Peter answered, you are the Messiah. You are the Christ, right? That word Messiah, Christ, same word. One's Greek, one's Hebrew, and it means anointed one. The one that God will send, right? The one who God anoints. And so we know that answer is right, by the way, because we started Mark in chapter 1, where Mark introduced Jesus as the Messiah. But the disciples have been wondering about that question themselves as they were on the boat, and they asked, who is this that can command the wind and the waves? They've been wondering, who is this Jesus? And now Jesus finally asked them the question that they have to really seek to understand. Who is Jesus? And Peter answers correctly, you are the Messiah. See, I think Peter's speaking for the disciples, right? He's that spokesman. And they've finally come to see clearly who Jesus is. He's the Messiah. That's an important term, I think, because it's on that term that the church is built. Who is Jesus? He's the Christ, the Son of the living God, right? And in Matthew, whenever we find this same story, Jesus says this. I'm going to read from Matthew chapter 16, verse 13. And this is a parallel, a synonymous gospel. And it just adds a little bit more detail that helps us to understand the importance of Peter's statement. But we get the same story. In verse 13, it says, when Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, who do people say the Son of Man is? They replied, some say John the Baptist, others Elijah, still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. He had added another person. But what about you, he asked, who do you say I am? Simon Peter answered, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Jesus replied, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build the church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. See, here's some cool things. He's not talking about Peter. That's not the rock he's talking about. He's talking about what Peter said. And what did Peter say? You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. You are the Messiah. And it's on that foundation that this church is built, that the church, more general, worldwide, is built on who Jesus is, the Messiah, the anointed one of God. See, the people had a hope for that Messiah in the first century. They were living under the oppression of Rome, looking forward to the Messiah coming. And now Jesus, who has shown himself to be so powerful that he can control the wind and the waves and cure the blind and feed the hungry, like he has shown himself to be so powerful, is finally here. And Peter gets it right. You are the Messiah. They began to see clearly who Jesus is. I guess the question is, do you see yet? Do you see clearly who Jesus is? Is he that Messiah, the one God has anointed to lead you from the oppression that is going on in your life? That's the foundation of the church. My second point is that the disciples are blind to his mission. See, they understand who he is, right? And Peter's got this high point. He finally gets it right. Up to this point, Jesus has been asking him, why are you so dull? Do you still not understand? And finally, Peter gets an answer right on the quiz. Who are you? Who am I? You are the Messiah. And then Jesus is going to go on to talk about the Messiah and what he must do. And I'm telling you, everything Jesus says about what the Messiah must do is not what the disciples expected. See, it messes with their preconceived ideas of the Messiah. See, in verse 31, he then begins to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law. and that he must be killed, and after 3 days raised again. Jesus begins to talk about the Son of Man and says this, that, look, I am the Messiah, and guess what? The Son of Man is going to suffer. Do you think Peter or any of the disciples thought that Jesus was going to suffer? No, that part of who Jesus was blurry to them because they were looking for someone, a Messiah who's going to come victoriously. Of course, Jesus does, but he has victory through defeat, through the cross, right? Not that messed with their preconceived ideas. Jesus talks about it, and he uses the term Son of Man, which is an interesting term. On its own, it just means child of Adam. So you guys are all sons and daughters of Adam, right? We all think we go back to that genealogy. You're sons and daughters of man. In a general sense, that's who you are. And then God will call Ezekiel, and he'll call him Son of Man. But Jesus, whenever he talks about it, has this qualifier. He's the Son of Man. Not just anyone. He is the Son of Man. And he's talking about a specific Son of Man. One that comes riding on the clouds. One who will overtake and rescue them from the animalistic kingdoms that they serve underneath. See, that happens in Daniel chapter 7. Daniel has this vision, and it's full of these kingdoms. The first one, it looks like a lion. The second one looks like a bear. The third one, it looks like a leopard. And the fourth one, I call it the transformer beast because it has metal teeth, right? And we know what these are. We're not blind to it, right? We know that Daniel saw a vision of a nation like Babylon and Persia and Greece and maybe Rome. And then after that, what happens? Verse 13 of Daniel says, in my vision I looked, and there before me was one like the Son of Man, coming on the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and people in every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. See the victory? When they started thinking about the Son of Man, they were thinking a kingdom that will never be destroyed, one that will never pass away. And that just doesn't seem to line up with what Jesus is saying, that the Messiah or the Son of Man is going to suffer at the hands of the religious leaders. He's going to be killed. And then in 3 days, he's going to rise. See, this upside down, maybe right side up kingdom is victory through defeat. It's different. The Son of Man is going to liberate. He's going to free them from the oppression, but not in the way Peter expects. Not in the way that most of the people living in the first century expect, but perhaps they should have. See, Isaiah talks about a suffering servant, right? One that is going to take the iniquity that we deserve. In Isaiah 53, I'm not going to read the whole chapter, but I could because the entire chapter is just like this. But look at what it says. Who has believed our message? In whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? He grew up before him like a tender shoot, like the root of a dry ground. And he had no beauty, no majesty to attract us to him. Nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering, familiar with our pain, like one whom people hide their faces. He was despised, and we held him in low esteem. Surely he took up our pain, and he bore our suffering. Yet he was considered, we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted, but he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all like sheep have gone astray. Each one of us has turned our own way, but the Lord has laid upon him the iniquity of us all. See, they should have expected a suffering servant because Isaiah talked about a suffering servant. And Jesus says, this is what the Son of Man will do. You may be looking for him to come and attack Rome, but it's going to be victory through defeat. He's going to be given over and beaten by the religious leaders. He's going to be killed, and he's going to rise again on the third day. See, victory there. But that doesn't stand with Peter's preconceived ideas of who Jesus is and what he's come to do. And I think this is really interesting. Look what Peter does. Jesus tells him that the Son of Man must suffer. And he speaks plainly about this. That's what it says in verse 32. He speaks plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Look at Peter's really got some nerve, doesn't he? I mean, here's Jesus. He's commanding the wind and the waves, and Peter thinks he's going to call him out and rebuke him. Set him straight. Don't you know the Messiah is going to be victorious? He's not going to be killed. Maybe that's what Peter's thinking. I find this interesting because Peter has a high spot, but does it last long? No. He can see Jesus clearly for who he is, but he is blind to what the mission is. He is blind to what Jesus has actually come to do. And when Jesus tells him, and he speaks plainly, it's not in parables, he speaks plainly. And Peter is so taken back because Jesus' plain speech doesn't match his preconceived ideas of who Jesus is, that he thinks he can rebuke Jesus. And Jesus has some strong words for him. See, in verse 33, but when Jesus turned and looked at the disciples, he rebuked Peter. Get behind me, Satan. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. He goes from the one who on this rock the church will be built to get behind me, Satan, just like that. Why? Because he understands first. He finally gets it. Jesus is the Messiah. But he's blind to what that actually means, what the mission of the Messiah is. See, I think there's a lot of people that in our society that are the same. They get it. If you ask a man on the street, who's Jesus, they'll give you the right answers, but they don't understand what he's done, the mission that he came to accomplish, the cost of our redemption. No, he was a man of sorrows. He took up our suffering that we deserved. It was laid on him. And for Peter, that cross is a stumbling block that people still trip on today, right? I mean, Paul talks about it. He says to the Jews, the gospel is foolishness, right? To the Jews, it's powerless. Let's read it out of Corinthians, chapter 1, verse 22. He says this. He says, Jews demand signs, and Greeks look for wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block for the Jews and foolishness to the Gentiles. And who was the first person to stumble over it? Peter. Get behind me, Satan. But we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to the Jews and foolishness to the Gentiles. But to those whom God has called, both Jew and Gentiles, Christ is the power of God and the wisdom of God. Peter doesn't stumble so far that he isn't able to get back to his feet, does he? No, of course not. See, Peter is the one who gets to preach that first gospel message. But he had trouble with what the Messiah would do, because although he could see Jesus clearly, he's blind to his mission. He's blind to understanding what he's come to do. My last point is that the cost of discipleship must be clear to us. See, because you can't understand who Jesus is apart from the cross. I mean, you really can't. You can call him the Messiah, but if you don't understand the cross, then you don't understand what he called us to do. Right? The cross for us is more than just redemption. The cross for us is a way of life. And that's a cost that you need to count before you decide to come on board. And see, Jesus in verse 34, he rebuked Peter, said, get behind me. And when he says, get behind me, I think he's saying, follow my example, get behind me. Because immediately after, he calls the crowd to him and the disciples, and he said to them this, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. Do you see the three things? See, the cross is not just the redemption that we have, it's the way of life that we have to live. That's what it means to be a disciple. Self-denial, taking up your cross and following him. And I like that when he says, anybody who wants to come after me must deny themselves. See, he's not saying deny something, right? Like, I can deny myself all kinds of things, right? Chocolate, soda. Lent comes around, and I think, I could just make it this many days with self-denial. Is that what Jesus is talking about? Or is he saying deny yourself? Not deny something, deny yourself. That's different. Because that means that I have to put myself behind Jesus in everything that I do and put him in front of me. Like Jesus says to Peter, get behind me. Don't try to get in front of me. Get behind me. Follow him. That's what it is to be a disciple, is to deny yourself and follow Jesus' lead. And do you think Jesus' lead is easy? No, because the Son of Man is going to be handed over to the religious leaders and ridiculed and killed, and in 3 days he's going to rise again. See, that's the example of self-denial. Someone who in his very nature was God, didn't consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage, but took on the image of a servant, being made in human likeness, made himself nothing. That's the example. That's self-denial. Are you ready to follow it? Because Jesus speaks plainly about what it means to be a disciple. It's not easy. It includes carrying your cross. I was thinking about that this week too, because when Jesus said that to the disciples, did they have any idea what that meant? Did they know that Jesus was going to go to the cross? That he was going to be beaten? Did they know yet that he was going to be victorious over the grave? I mean, he did just tell them that it would happen, but he didn't tell them how it would happen. The only information they have at this point is that he's going to be killed. They have no idea how. And Jesus says, take up the cross. For them, that was a shame, humiliation, making yourself low. Are you ready to do that? See, that's what it means to be a disciple. Self-denial and taking up your cross. And I have to tell you, there's lots of ways we can talk about personal suffering. Paul says it's a thorn in his flesh, right? He has a thorn of his flesh that he's prayed that God will take away. He never called that thorn his cross. And you ever hear people in church today say, oh yeah, dealing with that person, that's my cross to bear. Man, if that's your cross to bear, you don't understand the cross at all. That might be a thorn in your flesh, but that's not the cross. The cross is so much more, right? Now, I have plenty of thorns in my flesh, plenty of problems in my life. Those aren't the cross. The cross is more. And Jesus asks for more as well. He doesn't say just deny yourself. He doesn't say just take up your cross. He says you have to follow him. And if you don't know where he's going, he's marching towards Calvary. Are you ready to follow him? See, the cost of discipleship is high, and Jesus is talking plainly about it. And if you don't understand it, you need to, because Christianity isn't a hobby. It's not a weekend sport. It's not something we can do on our off time. It's not something we only take part of when we feel like it. No, it is a lifestyle. It is one that we put ourselves in the back of and put Jesus in front of us, and we just follow him. And it's not going to be an easy road. See, here's what Jesus goes on to say about this road. He says, for whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? See, you want real life? Give it up. See, it's a hard thing to do to be a disciple of Jesus. It means being willing to lay your life down. With Mark's original audience, that was a very literal thing. And for many people in our world, that's a very literal thing. For us, sometimes it might be just more metaphorical. We have to be willing to deny ourselves. We have to give our life up for the sake of the gospel. Because in doing that, that's when we're really going to find it. Do you see the paradox? It's something that doesn't seem to make sense. Our world says things like, live your life. Do what you need to do to be happy. Jesus doesn't say things like that. In fact, nowhere in this list does he say that you're going to have an easygoing, happy life. Yet every time we have a thorn in the flesh, we complain to God about it, don't we? Why are you doing this to me? Why am I going through this? And I think of this verse because Jesus says it's not going to be easy. In fact, if you want real life, you got to lay down your own. It's not an easy choice. It's not something that we can take halfway. It's just straddling a fence. Doesn't work. No, the cost of discipleship is clear to us. We know what it costs. It costs a lot. It's not an easy decision, but it's worth it. And I think that's what you have to carry with you because it's worth it. See, Jesus gives us that. He says, or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? See, you could have the whole world, and it's not in comparison to the life that Jesus can give. You can build bigger barns because you think that's what's going to make you happy, and it's not in comparison to what Jesus can give. You might have some difficulties in this life, but eternal life is so much better, isn't it? Life with Jesus, so much better than anything that this world can offer. So if you want real life, be willing to give up your own. And Jesus says that if anyone's ashamed of me and my words, this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes in his Father's glory with the holy angels. See that Son of Man coming on the clouds with the holy angels? Are you ready for it? I think as we started this sermon, we talked about the blind man. And at first he could see clearly, or he couldn't see clearly. Everything looked blurry to him. And maybe that's where the disciples are. They begin to see who Jesus is, but it's still kind of blurry because they don't quite understand what he's come to do. The rest of the Gospel of Mark is going to get us to see clearly. That's what's going to happen. We're not only going to become to a place where we understand who Jesus is, which Mark has already gotten us to. We're going to come to a spot where we can understand what it means to be a disciple. What Jesus came to do, what it was his mission. He brings victory. And I believe he can bring healing to our life. I believe that he can bring wholeness to our life, peace with God. But it doesn't mean that it's going to be absent of conflict. Are you ready to be a disciple? Are you ready to follow him? Because that road is narrow.